Welcome back to my channel. Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past, told gently and slowly as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you watching the sunrise? Or is the moon hanging outside your window, as it is mine? If these calm historical narratives bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe and come along for many more. When most people think of ancient Egypt, their minds immediately go to the spectacular monuments, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Sphinx, the Valley of the Kings. These incredible structures that have captivated imaginations for thousands of years. But here's what those tourism brochures don't tell you. Every single one of these marvels was built on the backs of a massive agricultural system that treated human beings like disposable equipment. The farmers weren't just growing food, they were feeding the machine of pharaonic power. And that machine had an absolutely insatiable appetite for human suffering. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life actually looked like for these forgotten souls you're living in. What amounts to a mudbrick H along the Nile sharing space with your extended family, your livestock, and whatever vermin have decided to move in. The walls are cracking, the roof leaks when the rains come, and privacy is a concept that simply doesn't exist. Your entire world revolves around the rhythm of the river, but not in some romantic pastoral way. No, your life is dictated by a flooding cycle that can mean the difference between barely surviving another year and watching your children starve to death. The ancient Egyptians divided their year into 3 seasons, and each one brought its own special brand of misery. For the farming class, first came an inundation season when the Nile would flood and cover the farmland. You might think this would be a time of rest, but you'd be dead wrong. This was when the Pharaoh's officials would round up farmers for construction projects. Suddenly, you're not a farmer anymore. You're a construction worker, hauling massive stone blocks under the blazing sun, building monuments to rulers who see you as less valuable than the oxen pulling their chariots. Then came the growing season, when the floods receded and left behind the fertile silt that made Egyptian agriculture possible. This sounds nice in theory, but in practice, it meant months of dawn to dusk labor in fields that belonged to someone else. You'd be plowing with primitive wooden tools, sowing seeds by hand, and praying to gods who seemed to have a personal vendetta against the working class. Every seed planted was a gamble. Too little water, and your crops would wither too much and they'd rot. Get it wrong, and the consequences weren't just economic hardship. They were life and death. Finally came Shemu, the harvest season, which was simultaneously the most crucial and most brutal time of the year. This was when the government's true colors showed. Teams of scribes would descend on farming communities like vultures, calculating exactly how much grain each plot had produced. And here's where things got really ugly. The state's portion came first. Always the pharaoh, the temples, the nobility, the bureaucrats. They all got their cut before you saw a single grain. What was left barely kept farming families alive. And in bad years, there simply wasn't enough left to matter. But the taxation system was just the beginning of the nightmare. Egyptian farmers lived under what can only be described as a form of agricultural feudalism that made medieval serfdom look like a vacation resort. You couldn't leave your village without permission. You couldn't change occupations. You couldn't even marry outside your social class without approval from officials who viewed you as property of the state. Your children were automatically enrolled in the same system of oppression, creating generation after generation of people trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. The tools these farmers worked with were primitive beyond belief. We're talking wooden plows that barely scratched the surface of the earth, hoes made from tree branches, sickles that were little more than sharpened sticks with flint edges. Meanwhile, the ruling class was commissioning elaborate golden burial masks and building monuments that required engineering knowledge. We're still trying to fully understand the technological gap between the rulers and the ruled wasn't just about wealth. It was about a deliberate decision to keep the working class trapped in conditions that made rebellion practically impossible. Egyptian farming wasn't just physically demanding. It was a psychological war of attrition designed to break the human spirit. Imagine spending your entire life producing food that you'll never have enough of, building monuments you'll never be allowed to enter, and supporting a system that treats your death as a minor accounting adjustment. The average life expectancy for Egyptian farmers was somewhere around 30 years, and most of those years were spent in various states of malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease. The bureaucracy that governed these farmers was a masterpiece of oppressive efficiency. Every aspect of agricultural life was monitored, measured, and taxed. Scribes kept detailed records of every farmer's output, every animal owned, every tool possessed. These weren't just administrative records. They were instruments of control. Fall behind on your quotas, and you'd face punishments that ranged from beatings to forced labor to having your family's food rations cut. Even further, disease was another constant companion in the Egyptian farmer's life. Working in flooded fields meant constant exposure to waterborne parasites and infections. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease that causes internal bleeding and organ damage, was so common among farmers that archaeologists can identify ancient Egyptian agricultural workers just by looking at their bones. The irrigation channels that made Egyptian agriculture possible were also perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes carrying malaria and other deadly diseases. The social hierarchy in ancient Egypt was rigid, beyond modern comprehension. Farmers occupied one of the lowest rungs on the social ladder, just above slaves and just below artisans. But unlike slaves, who at least had the theoretical protection of being valuable property, farmers were viewed as renewable resources. They could be worked to death and easily replaced by their children or by farmers from other regions. This created a system where human life had less value than the grain. It produced women in farming families faced additional layers of brutality. They were expected to work the fields alongside men, while also bearing and raising children. Maintaining households and processing food. Pregnancy wasn't an excuse for lighter duties. Childbirth happened in conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Infant mortality rates among farming families were astronomical, and mothers who lost children were expected to simply get back to work, as if nothing had happened. The religious system that dominated Egyptian society offered farmers very little comfort, while the Pharaoh was considered a living god, and the nobility enjoyed elaborate burial rituals designed to ensure their comfort in the afterlife. Farmers were told that their suffering in this life was part of the natural order. The concept of Mahat, or cosmic balance, was used to justify a system where a tiny elite lived in unimaginable luxury while the masses barely survived. Farmers were taught that accepting their brutal lot in life was not just necessary, but morally correct. What makes the story of Egyptian farmers even more tragic is how their suffering was systematically erased from the historical record. The monuments they built carried the names of pharaohs and nobles. The art they enabled focused on gods and kings. The literature they supported praised the wisdom of rulers and the glory of the state, but the farmers themselves, they were invisible. Anonymous, disposable. Their stories survive only in administrative records that treat them like livestock, or in archaeological evidence of their broken bodies and shortened lives. Yet despite all this oppression, Egyptian farmers developed remarkable strategies for survival and resistance. They created informal networks for sharing resources. During bad years, they developed their own folk religions that provided comfort. The official state religion denied them. They found ways to hide small portions of their harvest from the tax collectors. They taught their children skills that might just maybe offer a path to a slightly better life. These weren't grand gestures of rebellion. They were quiet acts of defiance that kept the human spirit alive in conditions designed to crush it completely. The impact of this agricultural system extended far beyond individual suffering. It created a civilization that was fundamentally unstable, dependent on the systematic exploitation of the majority of its population. The great monuments of ancient Egypt weren't just built with stone and mortar. They were built with human misery. And that foundation of suffering ultimately contributed to the civilization's decline. When the system finally began to collapse, the farmers who had had it for thousands of years had no reason to fight for its preservation. Understanding the lives of Egyptian farmers forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how civilization itself has often been built. The wonders of the ancient world that we admire today came at a human cost that's almost impossible to calculate. Every pyramid represents thousands of farmers who died young from overwork and malnutrition. Every temple represents families torn apart by forced labor. Every golden artifact represents grain that could have fed hungry children, but instead went to support the luxury of the ruling class. This isn't ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant to our modern world. The patterns of exploitation that define the lives of Egyptian farmers echo through history and continue to shape our world today. The same dynamics that allowed pharaohs to extract wealth from farmers while giving nothing back can be seen in countless modern contexts. The same bureaucratic systems that monitored and controlled every aspect of farmers' lives have evolved into contemporary forms of surveillance and control. As we delve deeper into the specific details of how this system operated, we'll discover that the brutality wasn't accidental or incidental. It was carefully designed and systematically implemented by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The suffering of Egyptian farmers wasn't a side effect of building a great civilization. It was the foundation upon which that civilization was deliberately constructed. The story of Egyptian farmers is ultimately a story about power, about how those who control resources use that control to extract maximum value from human lives while giving back as little as possible. It's about how systems of oppression sustain themselves by convincing both the oppressed and the oppressors that the current arrangement is natural, necessary, and unchangeable. And it's about how ordinary people find ways to maintain their humanity, even in the face of systems designed to strip that humanity away. These forgotten millions who bent their backs under the Egyptian sun, who planted seeds they'd never harvest enough of, who built monuments they'd never be allowed to enter, deserve to have their stories told, not romanticized or sanitized, but told honestly, with all the brutality and all the quiet heroism that defined their lives. Because understanding their suffering helps us understand not just ancient Egypt, but the human cost of civilization itself. But the flooding of the Nile, for all its life-giving properties, was also a harbinger of back-breaking labor that would consume the next several months of a farmer's existence, as the waters receded, leaving behind their precious cargo of fertile silt. The real work began, and this work was nothing short of brutal. Picture, if you will, the scene that unfolded across the Nile Valley. As the floodwaters retreated, thousands upon thousands of farmers, their bodies already weakened by months of meager rations during the flood season, now faced the Herculean task of preparing the muddy, waterlogged fields for planting. They had no mechanized equipment, no modern tools to ease their burden. Instead, they relied on the most primitive implements imaginable. The wooden plow, essentially unchanged for millennia, was dragged through the heavy clay-rich soil by teams of oxen, or more commonly, by the farmers themselves. When animals were too valuable to risk injury, these plows were crude affairs, little more than sharpened wooden stakes attached to handles that barely scratched the surface of the compacted earth to break up the soil. Properly required multiple passes, each one demanding every ounce of strength the farmer could muster. But even before the plowing could begin, there was the matter of clearing the fields. The Nile's flood didn't just deposit fertile silt. It also left behind a chaotic mess of debris, fallen trees, rotting vegetation, dead animals, stones, and accumulated refuse from upstream settlements all had to be manually removed. Farmers would wade through the thick, sucking mud, often up to their knees, hauling away debris with their bare hands. The work was not just physically exhausting, but genuinely dangerous. Hidden beneath the murky water were sharp objects, poisonous snakes seeking refuge in contaminated materials that could cause deadly infections. The ancient Egyptian farmer's day began before dawn and ended well after sunset. There was no concept of weekends, no labor unions to protect them, no regulations limiting their working hours. They labored under the scorching Egyptian sun, their skin darkening and cracking, their hands becoming gnarled masses of calluses and open wounds. Dehydration was a constant threat. But water was precious and often contaminated. Many farmers developed what we would now recognize as heat stroke, but they had no choice but to continue working or face the wrath of their overseers. And those overseers were merciless. Armed with whips and staffs, they patrolled the fields like prison guards, ready to deliver swift and brutal punishment to any farmer who showed signs of slowing down these men. Often former farmers themselves, who had been elevated to this position through loyalty or cunning, understood that their own survival depended on meeting the impossible quotas set by the administrative hierarchy above them. They drove the workers relentlessly, viewing them not as human beings, but as tools to be used until they broke. The planting season brought its own unique torments. Seeds had to be planted at precisely the right depth and spacing, a task that required farmers to bend over for hours at a time, their backs screaming in agony. They moved across the fields in long lines, dropping seeds by hand into the furrows they had carved with their primitive plows. There was no time for rest, no mercy for the elderly or infirm. Pregnant women worked alongside the men until the very moment of labor, and new mothers returned to the fields within days of giving birth. But perhaps most cruel of all was the constant knowledge that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they sacrificed, the fruits of their labor would never truly be theirs. The ancient Egyptian taxation system was designed to extract maximum value from the farmers, while leaving them just enough to survive until the next season. Tax collectors backed by soldiers would arrive at the farms with measuring equipment and detailed records calculating exactly how much grain, livestock, and produce was owed to the state. These tax assessments were often impossibly high, deliberately set above what the farmers could reasonably produce. This wasn't an accident or poor planning. It was a deliberate strategy designed to keep the farming population in a state of perpetual debt and dependence. When farmers couldn't meet their obligations, they were forced to borrow from state granaries at crushing interest rates, effectively enslaving themselves and their families for generations to come. The psychological toll of this system cannot be overstated. Imagine working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months on end, knowing that the grain you're harvesting will fill the stomachs of nobles and priests while your own children go hungry. Imagine watching your elderly parents collapse from exhaustion in the fields, knowing that stopping to help them might result in beatings for both of you. Imagine the helpless rage of seeing tax collectors cart away the very food your family needs to survive the coming year. Yet the farmers endured because they had no choice. Resistance meant death, not just for themselves, but for their families. The Egyptian state had perfected a system of collective punishment that ensured compliance through terror. If one farmer in a village failed to meet his quota, the entire community might face reduced rations or increased work demands. If a village showed signs of unrest, soldiers might arrive to make examples of the supposed ringleaders displaying their tortured bodies as warnings to others. The isolation of farming communities made organized resistance nearly impossible. Farmers were scattered across vast distances, worked to exhaustion, and kept ignorant of conditions beyond their immediate area. They had no means of communication with farmers in other regions, no way to coordinate efforts or share information about their treatment. The administrative system was designed to prevent any sense of solidarity or collective identity among the farming population, and so they suffered in silence, generation after generation. Their lives measured not in years, but in harvest seasons, their worth calculated not in human dignity, but in bushels of grain and head of cattle. They were the invisible foundation upon which one of history's greatest civilizations was built. Their blood and sweat, literally fertilizing the soil that would feed the empire. The brutal irony is that these farmers who created the agricultural surplus that made Egyptian civilization possible were systematically excluded from participating in that civilization. They could not read the hieroglyphs that celebrated their pharaohs. They could not enter the temples built with their labor. They could not enjoy the art, literature, music, and philosophy that their work made possible. They existed in a parallel world of endless toil, forever separated from the culture they sustained. This separation wasn't accidental. It was a carefully maintained feature of Egyptian society, designed to preserve the fiction that the achievements of the civilization belonged solely to the elite. The farmers were written out of their own story, their contributions erased from the historical record, their suffering deemed unworthy of documentation. When we marvel at the pyramids, today we're seeing monuments to this erasure, massive stone testaments to a system that transformed human misery into architectural glory. The farmers knew this. Of course, they weren't stupid or ignorant. Despite what the elite wanted others to believe, they understood exactly how the system worked and where they fit within it. They knew that their children would inherit their same fate, that their suffering served to perpetuate the comfort of others, that their lives were considered expendable by those who benefited from their labor. This knowledge was perhaps the cruelest burden of all the understanding, that their oppression wasn't accidental or temporary, but fundamental to the system itself. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly as Kayat wiped the sweat from his brow, his calloused hands trembling from exhaustion. Another day of back-breaking labor stretched endlessly before him, just as it had for his father and his father's father, stretching back through countless generations of Egyptian farmers whose names would never be carved in stone or whispered in the halls of pharaohs, while the great pyramids rose majestically on the horizon, monuments to divine kingship and eternal glory. Khwiseh and millions like him lived lives of such grinding brutality that death often seemed a merciful release from their earthly torment. The irrigation season had arrived with its own special brand of hell as the Nile's waters receded, leaving behind the precious silt that would determine whether families lived or starved farmers like Kimaset faced the Herculean task of reshaping the very landscape itself, armed with nothing more than primitive wooden hose copper-bladed tools that bent and broke under pressure, and baskets woven from reeds. They would spend months moving millions of tons of earth by hand. The shadeds, those iconic counterweight irrigation devices we see in museum displays, required teams of men to operate from dawn until dusk, their backs screaming in agony as they lifted endless buckets of water to flood the fields. But the irrigation work was just the beginning of their suffering. The Egyptian agricultural system operated on a principle of maximum extraction, where every grain of wheat, every strand of flax, every head of barley was accounted for by scribes, whose mathematical precision would have impressed modern accountants. Farmers were required to meet quotas that left them with barely enough seed for the next planting season, let alone sufficient food to feed their families through the lean months. The taxation system was so comprehensive that it included not just crops, but livestock, textiles, and even the labor of the farmers themselves, who were conscripted for royal building projects during the flood season. When agricultural work was impossible, the physical toll of this existence was devastating. Archaeological evidence reveals that Egyptian farmers suffered from chronic malnutrition, arthritis, and spinal deformities caused by decades of bending over crops and carrying impossible loads. Their life expectancy hovered around 35 years, and those who survived longer bore the visible scars of their labor: hunched backs, gnarled hands, and the hollow-eyed look of people who had seen too much suffering. Women faced additional horrors, with maternal mortality rates so high that pregnancy was often seen as a death sentence. Yet children were essential for survival, creating a cruel cycle where families needed offspring to work the land but risked losing mothers in the process. The social hierarchy pressed down on these farmers with the weight of divine authority. The Pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living god, and this religious framework justified the most extreme forms of exploitation. Farmers were not citizens but property of the state, bound to their land like medieval serfs. But with even fewer rights, they could be relocated at will, separated from their families to work on royal projects or simply work to death if the harvest demanded it. The administrative records that have survived paint a picture of a bureaucracy obsessed with control, where every farmer's movements were tracked, every tool accounted for, and every failure to meet quotas punished with brutal efficiency. The psychological warfare waged against these people was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. Egyptian society was built on the concept of Mahat, divine order, and balance, which was used to convince farmers that their suffering was not only necessary, but righteous. The priests, who controlled both religious doctrine and much of the land, preached that earthly hardship was preparation for the afterlife, but only the wealthy could afford the elaborate burial rites that supposedly guaranteed eternal bliss for farmers. Death meant being wrapped in the cheapest materials and buried in shallow graves in the desert, if they were lucky enough to avoid being left for the scavengers. The seasonal rhythms that governed farm life created their own patterns of misery during the flood season. When the Nile transformed the valley into a vast lake, farmers were conscripted as laborers for pharaonic building projects. These were not noble endeavors, but death camps disguised as divine missions, where men hauled massive stone blocks through the desert heat, many collapsing from exhaustion and being simply replaced by the next wave of conscripts. The lucky ones returned home in time for planting season. But countless thousands never saw their families again. Their bones scattered across construction sites from Memphis to Aswan. When the floods receded and planting season began, farmers faced impossible deadlines with inadequate tools. They had to prepare vast fields using wooden plows pulled by cattle that were often as malnourished as their human handlers. The seed grain carefully hoarded from the previous harvest had to be distributed with mathematical precision. Any waste meant starvation. Later children as young as 5 were pressed into service, scaring birds from the fields with wooden clappers, their small bodies already showing signs of the malnutrition that would stunt their growth and shorten their lives. The harvest season brought its own terrors as teams of workers raced against time to gather crops before the scorching heat destroyed them. The sickles they used were crude bronze affairs that dulled quickly and cut hands as often as grain women and children followed behind the reapers, gathering every stalk, every grain that fell to the ground because nothing could be wasted. The threshing floors became scenes of organized chaos as cattle trampled the grain, while workers separated wheat from chaff under the merciless supervision of overseers who carried whips and showed no mercy for exhaustion or heat stroke. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of farm life was the complete erasure of individual identity. Farmers had no surnames, no family histories recorded in the official records, no monuments to commemorate their achievements. They were simply production units in the Pharaoh's economic machine, valued only for their ability to generate surplus that could be extracted by the state. Their knowledge of agriculture accumulated over millennia was dismissed by the educated classes as mere peasant superstition. Even though this knowledge fed the entire civilization, the technological stagnation that characterized Egyptian farming was not accidental, but deliberate. The ruling classes had no incentive to improve agricultural efficiency because human labor was essentially free and endlessly replaceable. Why develop better plows when you could simply conscript more farmers? Why invest in irrigation improvements when you could force workers to move water by hand? This technological conservatism trapped farmers in cycles of inefficiency that made their work exponentially harder than it needed to be. Women in farming communities faced compounded oppression, bearing the full burden of domestic labor. While also working in the fields during peak seasons, they ground grain by hand using stone quows that destroyed their joints, wove textiles that would be confiscated as taxes, and raised children who would likely die before reaching adulthood. The few records that mention farm women at all describe them as property, transferred from father to husband, like livestock with no legal rights or social standing, independent of the men who owned them. The religious festivals that punctuated the agricultural calendar offered no respite for farmers who were expected to provide offerings they could not afford while continuing their labor. The great temples that dominated every city were built with wealth extracted from their sweat, yet they were barred from entering the sacred precincts except as laborers or sacrifice victims. The gods they were told to worship demanded tribute that kept their families hungry, creating a spiritual crisis that compounded their physical suffering. Disease ravaged farming communities with particular ferocity, as malnutrition weakened immune systems and unsanitary conditions bred pestilence, bilharzia, a parasitic infection from irrigation water left millions suffering from chronic fatigue and organ damage. Malaria spread by mosquitoes, breeding in stagnant floodwaters, killed thousands annually. Eye infections from dust and debris left many partially or completely blind, yet they were still expected to work until they collapsed. The climate itself seemed designed to torment these people with temperature swings that could kill the unprepared and sandstorms that buried entire villages. The Clemson winds brought months of choking dust that made breathing difficult and work nearly impossible. Yet the agricultural calendar showed no mercy. For weather conditions, farmers learned to work through heat that would hospitalize modern people. Their bodies adapted through generations of suffering to endure conditions that should have been lethal tools, and equipment were deliberately kept primitive to maintain dependence on human labor, while Egyptian craftsmen could create intricate jewelry and precision instruments for the elite farmers, were given wooden implements that broke constantly and required endless repair. The metal tools that did exist were so valuable that they were locked away at night and counted daily with severe punishments for any that went missing. This artificial scarcity forced farmers to spend precious time maintaining inadequate equipment. Instead of improving their techniques, the record-keeping system that allowed Egypt to function as a complex state was built on the complete surveillance of farming communities. Scribes recorded every birth, death, marriage, and harvest, not out of care for the people, but to maximize extraction of resources. These records, written on papyrus that farmers could never afford, contained detailed inventories of their possessions, their children, their livestock, treating human beings as mere entries in an accounting ledger. As we examine the archaeological evidence from farming settlements, we find layers of human misery preserved in the artifacts of daily life: grinding stones worn smooth by generations of use, children's toys carved from scraps of wood, cooking pots patched and repatched until they crumbled. These objects tell stories of people making do with nothing, finding moments of humanity in conditions designed to crush the human spirit. The irrigation networks that made Egyptian agriculture possible were marvels of engineering, but they were built and maintained by farmers who received no credit for their expertise. The complex calculations required to manage water flow, the precise timing needed to maximize flood benefits, the intricate understanding of soil conditions. All of this knowledge resided in the minds of people who were treated as ignorant laborers by their social superiors. The brutal irony of Egyptian civilization is that its greatest achievements, the monuments and artworks that still inspire or today, were made possible by the systematic destruction of human lives on an industrial scale. Every stone block in the pyramids represents hours of unpaid labor by people whose names we will never know. Every golden treasure in the Pharaoh's tomb was bought with grain stolen from farmers' children. Every beautiful temple relief was carved by artisans fed with bread taken from the mouths of the hungry. And yet, despite everything, these farmers possessed a resilience that kept Egyptian civilization functioning for over 3 millennia. They developed agricultural techniques that sustained one of the world's first urban civilizations. They passed down knowledge through oral traditions that preserved practical wisdom across generations. They found ways to maintain family bonds and community connections, even under the most oppressive conditions. Their endurance in the face of systematic brutality represents one of history's greatest testimonies to the strength of the human spirit. The Egyptian farmers lived lives of such unrelenting hardship that their suffering echoes across the millennia, a reminder of the human cost of civilizational grandeur. Their stories lost to official history, but preserved in the archaeological record, reveal the true foundation upon which all human achievement rests: the uncounted millions who toiled in obscurity so that a few might live in splendor. Looking at the script summary and reference videos, I'll continue from where the narrative left off after covering the brutal lives of Egyptian farmers through their seasonal cycles, social hierarchy, and resilience. Here's part 4. Yet for all the systematic brutality designed to crush the human spirit, the Egyptian farmer possessed something that no amount of oppression could fully extinguish: the knowledge that their survival depended not just on submission, but on cunning adaptation in the shadows of the great monuments they built. Farmers developed an intricate network of quiet resistance that allowed them to preserve fragments of dignity in an otherwise dehumanizing existence. The the most fundamental act of defiance was simply staying. Cut to starvation levels, farmers became masters of foraging. Knowing every edible plant that grew along the Nile's banks, they learned to identify which lotus roots could be ground into flour, which papyrus shoots could supplement their meager bread, and how to catch fish with makeshift traps during the brief moments when overseers weren't watching. These weren't skills passed down through formal education, but whispered knowledge shared between mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, in the precious few moments when families could gather without supervision. Women in particular developed elaborate systems for hiding food and resources. They would weave secret compartments into their clothing, bury small caches of grain in locations marked by seemingly random stones, and create networks of mutual aid that operated entirely outside the official hierarchy when a family's grain stores were confiscated. As punishment, other families would mysteriously find ways to share their own meager supplies, always careful to make it appear accidental rather than deliberate charity that could be punished. The farmers also learned to read the moods and patterns of their overseers with the same precision they used to predict the Nile's floods. They knew which taskmaster could be appeased with extra deference, which one might look the other way if approached at the right moment, and how to time their requests for the brief periods when officials were distracted by their own concerns. This wasn't collaboration with oppression, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how to navigate a brutal system without being completely destroyed by it. Perhaps most remarkably, farmers found ways to maintain their spiritual lives. Despite constant surveillance, the official state religion demanded their participation in rituals glorifying the Pharaoh, but in the darkness of their huts, families would whisper prayers to older gods, the deities of the fields and the river who had watched over Egyptian farmers long before the first pyramid was built. They would carve tiny protective amulets from scraps of stone or clay, hide them in their clothing, and pass down oral traditions that connected them to generations of ancestors who had worked the same soil. Children learned these survival skills almost before they could walk. A 3-year-old might appear to be simply playing in the dirt, but was actually learning to identify different types of soil and their properties. A young girl helping her mother with domestic tasks was simultaneously memorizing the locations of hidden food stores and learning the subtle hand signals that warned of approaching overseers' boys working in the fields, absorbed not just agricultural techniques, but the complex social intelligence needed to survive in a world where a moment's inattention could result in a beating, or worse. The farmers' resistance wasn't always passive. During periods when the state's attention was focused elsewhere on foreign wars or internal palace intrigue, small acts of sabotage would mysteriously occur. Tools would break at crucial moments, slowing down construction projects. Irrigation channels would develop unexpected problems that required time-consuming repairs. Grain stores would be discovered to have suffered from pest infestations that could have been prevented with more careful attention. These incidents were always plausibly accidental, but their timing and frequency suggested a level of coordination that the authorities suspected but could never prove. Knowledge itself became a form of resistance, while the official scribes recorded only what served the state's interests. Farmers maintained their own informal systems of record-keeping. They remembered which fields produced the best crops in which years, tracked the long-term patterns of flood and drought that official records ignored, and preserved techniques for crop rotation and soil management that had been developed over centuries of practical experience. This knowledge was power, and farmers guarded it carefully, sharing it only with those they trusted completely. The seasonal cycles that defined their agricultural work also provided natural opportunities for community building. that the authorities couldn't entirely suppress during planting season. When large groups of farmers worked together in the fields, information could be shared through work songs that appeared to be simple entertainment, but actually carried coded messages about everything, from food shortages to the movements of tax collectors, harvest celebrations, even when monitored by officials became opportunities for families separated by the demands of forced labor to reconnect and share news. But perhaps the most profound form of resistance was the farmers' refusal to internalize the dehumanizing ideology of their oppressors, despite constant messaging that they were nothing more than tools for the Pharaoh's use. Farmers maintained strong, family bonds, took pride in their skills, and passed down values of cooperation and mutual aid to their children. They refused to accept that their suffering was natural or inevitable. Instead, viewing it as an injustice that had to be endured, but never embraced the psychological toll of this constant resistance, was enormous living under such intense surveillance and control, never knowing when a moment's relaxation might result in punishment, created a state of chronic stress that manifested in both physical and mental health problems. Farmers aged prematurely, their bodies worn down, not just by physical labor, but by the constant tension of navigating a hostile environment. Sleep was often fitful, interrupted by nightmares about overseers and tax collectors. Many developed nervous habits, unconscious behaviors that helped them cope with anxiety, but also marked them as people living under extreme pressure. Yet even this suffering became a source of strength and solidarity. Farmers who had endured the worst punishments often became informal leaders in their communities, their survival serving as proof that the system, however brutal, was not all-powerful. They would share strategies for enduring beatings, techniques for maintaining hope during the darkest periods, and most importantly, the conviction that their oppressor's power, however vast it seemed, was ultimately fragile and dependent on the farmers' continued labor. The irony was not lost on the farmers themselves. The very people who built the monuments designed to proclaim the Pharaoh's eternal power were also the ones who understood most clearly how temporary and artificial that power actually was. They had seen dynasties rise and fall, watched as the grand projects of one ruler were abandoned by his successor, and observed how quickly the mighty could be brought low by forces beyond their control. This long-term perspective, born from generations of survival, gave them a kind of wisdom that their oppressors, for all their education and privilege, could never possess. In the end, the story of Egyptian farmers is not just one of victimization, but of the extraordinary human capacity to maintain dignity, community, and hope. Even under the most brutal circumstances, their resistance may not have overthrown the system that oppressed them, but it ensured that system never completely succeeded in its goal of reducing human beings to mere instruments of production. In their quiet defiance, their networks of mutual aid, and their refusal to surrender their humanity, these forgotten farmers achieved a victory that outlasted all the monuments built on their backs. They proved that the human spirit, however battered and constrained, remains ultimately unconquerable. Their legacy reminds us that even in the darkest periods of history, when power seems absolute and resistance appears futile, ordinary people find ways to preserve what makes life worth living. The Egyptian farmers who built civilization's greatest monuments may have died in obscurity, but their example of resilience in the face of overwhelming oppression continues to inspire anyone who refuses to accept that suffering and exploitation are the natural order of things. Here's part 5 of the 12-part script for Boring History: The Brutal Lives of Egyptian Farmers, despite their invisibility in official records and their systematic dehumanization by the state apparatus. Egyptian farmers developed remarkable networks of resistance and survival that sustained them through centuries of oppression. These covert systems of mutual aid and knowledge sharing represented one of the most sophisticated forms of grassroots organization in the ancient world, yet they operated entirely in the shadows of documented history. The farmers created intricate communication networks that stretched across the Nile Valley, allowing information about tax collectors, labor conscriptions, and survival strategies to flow between villages faster than official messengers could travel. They developed coded language and symbols carved into irrigation tools and etched onto pottery shards, creating a secret alphabet of resistance that allowed them to coordinate responses to government demands without detection by scribal authorities during the harshest periods of taxation and forced labor. Farming communities established hidden granaries and underground storage systems that were invisible to tax assessors. These secret caches were maintained collectively, with each family contributing a portion of their harvest to communal reserves that could sustain entire villages during times of extreme hardship. The locations of these stores were passed down through generations, using oral traditions disguised as religious songs and children's games. The farmers also developed sophisticated barter networks that operated entirely outside the official economy, allowing them to trade goods and services without involving the state currency systems that were heavily taxed and monitored. They created alternative measurement systems and quality standards that differed from official weights and measures, enabling them to conduct trade that was effectively invisible to government oversight. Perhaps most remarkably, the farming communities developed their own informal judicial systems for resolving disputes and managing resources. Village elders, usually chosen for their knowledge of farming techniques rather than their connections to the state, would mediate conflicts over water rights, land boundaries, and family disputes, using customary law that predated Pharaonic rule by millennia. These decisions were enforced through social pressure and community solidarity rather than state violence. The farmers' resistance extended to the realm of knowledge preservation and innovation, while official scribes recorded only information deemed useful to the state. Farming communities maintained their own libraries of practical knowledge encoded in folklore proverbs and ritual practices. They developed improved crop varieties, more efficient irrigation techniques, and better tools through collective experimentation, sharing these innovations through networks that ensured beneficial discoveries spread throughout the farming population, while remaining hidden from authorities who might attempt to monopolize or tax such improvements. Women played crucial roles in these resistance networks, often serving as the primary carriers of information between villages. Since their movements were less closely monitored than those of men, they developed elaborate systems of signals and messages embedded in textile patterns, food preparation methods, and market conversations that allowed them to coordinate community responses to government threats while maintaining the appearance of ordinary domestic activity. The farmers also created alternative religious and spiritual practices that provided psychological refuge from the dehumanizing effects of state oppression, while they were required to participate in official religious ceremonies honoring the Pharaoh and state gods. They maintained their own spiritual traditions that emphasized human dignity, community solidarity, and connection to the land. These practices often incorporated ancient agricultural festivals and seasonal celebrations that predated state religion, providing farmers with a sense of identity and purpose that existed independently of their official status as state property. During periods of extreme hardship, the farming communities developed sophisticated early warning systems that could detect approaching tax collectors, labor recruiters, or military conscription units. Days before they arrived, Farmers positioned as lookouts along major roads and river routes would relay information using smoke signals, reflected sunlight, and carefully timed agricultural activities that appeared routine to outside observers, but conveyed specific warnings to those who understood the code. The most dangerous form of resistance involved the deliberate sabotage of state projects and agricultural quotas. Farmers developed techniques for appearing to comply with government demands while actually undermining them. Through subtle but effective methods, they would plant crops in patterns that looked impressive to visiting officials, but were designed to fail at crucial moments, or they would construct irrigation works that appeared sound, but contained hidden flaws that would cause them to fail after the inspectors had moved on. These acts of resistance required extraordinary courage, as discovery meant not just death for the individual farmer, but potentially the destruction of entire families and communities. Yet the farming population maintained these networks of defiance for centuries, passing down techniques and knowledge through generations of oppressed workers who refused to accept that their suffering was inevitable or deserved. The farmers' resistance networks also served as preservation systems for cultural knowledge that the state attempted to suppress or control. They maintained oral histories that told different versions of events than those recorded in official chronicles, preserving memories of times when farming communities had greater autonomy and dignity. These alternative histories provided frameworks for understanding their current oppression as a temporary condition rather than a natural or divinely ordained state of affairs. The sophistication of these resistance systems reveals that despite their apparent powerlessness, Egyptian farmers possessed remarkable organizational abilities and strategic thinking. They created parallel institutions that provided many of the functions of government, education, religion, and economics, while operating entirely outside state control. These shadow systems allowed farming communities to maintain their humanity and dignity even under conditions designed to reduce them to mere production units. The psychological impact of these resistance networks cannot be overstated. While individual farmers might feel isolated and powerless when facing tax collectors or labor recruiters, the knowledge that they were part of a vast underground community of mutual support provided crucial emotional and spiritual sustenance. The simple act of participating in coded conversations or contributing to hidden food stores reminded farmers that they were human beings with agency and value, not just agricultural tools to be used and discarded by their masters. The farmers' ability to maintain these complex systems of resistance over centuries demonstrates a level of social organization and collective intelligence that challenges historical narratives, portraying them as passive victims of state oppression. While they could not directly overthrow the pharaonic system or escape their legal status, as unfree laborers, they created spaces of freedom and dignity within the constraints of their oppression that allowed them to preserve their humanity and pass on hope to future generations. These networks of resistance and survival represent one of the most remarkable achievements of the ancient world. Yet they remain largely invisible in historical records, precisely because their effectiveness depended on their secrecy. The farmers who created and maintained these systems were among the most skilled organizers and strategic thinkers of their time, developing solutions to problems of coordination, communication, and resource management that would challenge modern communities facing similar difficulties. The legacy of these resistance networks extended far beyond the individual farmers who participated in them, creating cultural patterns and social technologies that would influence Egyptian society for millennia. The traditions of community solidarity, mutual aid, and collective problem-solving that sustained farming communities through the worst periods of oppression would eventually contribute to broader social movements that challenged pharaonic authority and helped transform Egyptian civilization. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of the farmers' resistance was simply the preservation of human dignity under conditions designed to destroy it. In maintaining their networks of mutual support and cultural preservation, Egyptian farmers demonstrated that even the most sophisticated systems of oppression could not completely eliminate human agency and creativity. Their hidden acts of defiance and solidarity remind us that behind every monument to pharaonic power stood communities of people who refused to be reduced to mere instruments of state will, who maintain their humanity through collective action and mutual care. Even in the darkest of circumstances, looking at the script so far and the reference materials provided, I need to continue from where the narrative left off. The previous content covered Egyptian farmers developing resistance networks, so Part 6 should logically progress to show how these networks operated and their ultimate impact. Here's the continuation. Yet the true power of these resistance networks lay not merely in their ability to share resources or communicate in secret, but in their capacity to preserve and transmit knowledge that the Pharaonic state desperately sought to control. In the workshops hidden beneath mudbrick houses, master craftsmen taught their sons not just the techniques of metalwork and carpentry, but the sacred mathematics that governed the construction of temples and monuments. These were secrets the priestly class guarded jealously. Yet somehow they flowed through the underground channels of the farming communities, like water through hidden irrigation canals. The farmers understood something that their rulers had forgotten in their obsession with divine authority. Knowledge belonged to those who worked with their hands, who coaxed life from the earth, who understood the rhythms of flood and drought through generations of bitter experience. When a young scribe born to farming stock, but elevated through temple education, returned to his village with news of administrative changes or new taxation schemes, this intelligence spread through the resistance networks faster than official proclamations could reach. The provincial governors considered the extraordinary case of Kenti, a grain measurer from a village near Memphis during the reign of Amonat. The third official records paint him as a loyal functionary, dutiful in his collection of harvest quotas and meticulous in his accounting. Yet papyrus fragments discovered in workers' quarters tell a different story entirely. Kenti had developed an elaborate system of false measurements that consistently underreported village harvests by nearly 20%. The surplus grain, rather than filling royal granaries, was distributed among the poorest farming families and secretly cached in underground storage chambers. What made Kent's deception so remarkable was not its scale, but its sophistication. He had recruited a network of accomplices that included other measurers, transport supervisors, and even low-ranking priests responsible for blessing the harvest. Together, they created an entirely parallel accounting system, complete with forged seals and fictitious invoices that could withstand casual inspection by higher authorities for over 15 years. This network diverted thousands of bushels of grain from the state apparatus, providing a crucial buffer against famine for countless farming families. The psychological warfare these networks waged was perhaps even more devastating than their material resistance. Farming communities developed elaborate mythologies that undermined the divine pretensions of their rulers. Stories spread of pharaohs who had been farmers in previous lives, of gods who favored the humble over the mighty of ancient kings, who had lost their thrones because they forgot the wisdom of the soil. These weren't merely folk tales told around evening fires. They were carefully crafted narratives designed to delegitimize the entire ideological foundation of pharaonic rule. The farmers created their own calendar of celebration that deliberately competed with official religious festivals, while the state celebrated the Pharaoh's divine birth. Farming communities marked the first sprouting of grain seedlings with elaborate rituals that honored the earth itself rather than its supposed divine ruler. These counter-celebrations served multiple purposes. They reinforced community bonds, preserved pre-dynastic religious traditions, and provided cover for resistance meetings under the guise of religious observance. Women played a particularly crucial role in these networks. Their movements between villages to attend births, weddings, and funerals, providing perfect cover for the transmission of information and resources. The elderly midwife traveling to assist with a difficult delivery might carry hidden messages about troop movements or tax collection schedules. The young bride moving to her husband's village brought not only dowry goods, but intelligence about administrative changes in her home district. Through these seemingly innocent social connections, the resistance networks maintained communication across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. The networks also developed sophisticated early warning systems for detecting informants and state agents. Farming communities had always been suspicious of strangers, but the resistance elevated this natural caution into an art form. New arrivals to villages faced subtle tests of their knowledge and loyalties, probing questions disguised as casual conversation that could reveal whether someone possessed the insider knowledge of a genuine farmer or the superficial understanding of an urban spy. Those who failed these tests found themselves excluded from community activities and cut off from the flow of information. Perhaps most remarkably, these resistance networks maintained their cohesion across multiple generations through the development of what we might recognize today as oral constitutions, complex codes of conduct, procedures for decision-making, and methods for resolving disputes were embedded in traditional songs, proverbs, and ritual practices that passed from parent to child. A seemingly innocent work song might contain detailed instructions for identifying trustworthy allies. A traditional blessing recited at harvest time could encode the procedures for safely distributing surplus grain to needy families. The networks adapted constantly to changing circumstances, developing new techniques as the state apparatus evolved. When the administration began using literacy tests to identify potential scribes for recruitment, farming communities responded by deliberately hiding the reading abilities of their children. When new taxation methods were introduced, the networks quickly developed countermeasures. When foreign invasions disrupted traditional power structures, the resistance networks proved far more resilient than the official bureaucracy, maintaining order and providing services when state authority collapsed entirely. These underground systems of mutual aid